Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's get started and look into the first article. The first article says Spectrum Price Row. Before we understand what this article is all about, let's understand some basics with respect to this article. What do we understand by spectrum? We are all aware of the electromagnetic radiation. It consists of radio waves, microwaves, infrared, visible light, ultraviolet rays, X-rays as well as the gamma rays. When it comes to the communication, the most important waves that we make use of is called as the radio waves. What are radio waves? Radio waves are those that have frequency of 3 kilohertz up until 300 gigahertz. So when we speak about waves, they are defined by attributes of wavelength. What is the wavelength? It is the length of the wave. Then we have to take into picture amplitude, which is the height of the wave, and the frequency, which is the number of cycles per second. So when we speak about the audible frequency for the human, it is about 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. So what is spectrum here? Spectrum in this specific case, with respect to the spectrum price row, we are speaking about the radio waves. So what is the spectrum here? Spectrum with respect to this article is basically in reference to the radio waves. Now the question is, what is the spectrum auction? We just discussed about the spectrum. Auctioning this spectrum into the public forum whereby the private players would be able to buy them is what is called as the spectrum auction, which is controlled by the government, which is why it is called as spectrum management. Why is the government auctioning the spectrum? That is because when we speak about the minerals, what exactly happens? It is a public resource. The public resource is controlled by the government. Then we also have gas, then we also have oil, we also have many other public properties as well. These are synonymous with public holding. However, it is controlled by the government. Similarly, spectrum is also a public resource which, if auctioned, the money generated where a private player will be buying this particular spectrum, a particular area in the spectrum, will ultimately be used by the government for the welfare schemes and programs. So what is spectrum auction? The spectrum which is released by the government so that the private players would be able to buy them, and the money that they pay to the government will be ultimately used for the welfare schemes and programs. What is this article speaking about? The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India released recommendations on the auction of spectrum, including those likely to be used for the offering of the 5G services. The telecom regulator has suggested cutting prices of airways across various bands by 35 to 40% from its earlier proposed base price. So we have the Telecom Regulatory Authority, which is planning to cut down the auction price by about 35 to 40%. When we look into the details, the telecom regulatory has recommended that all available spectrum in the existing bands, that is 700 MHz, 800 MHz, 900 MHz, 1800 MHz, 2100 MHz, 2300 MHz, 2500 MHz should be put for auction, along with airwaves in new bands such as 600 MHz, 3300 to 3600 MHz and 24.25 to 28.5 gigahertz. When this is put for the auction, private players will be able to bid for it, and ultimately they will be able to take a particular frequency in this particular band, and the same can be used for the communication purposes. If people have to communicate, what you require is a particular frequency for which people would be able to speak, they would be able to interact in their mobile phones so that there is no interference. So these private players like Vodafone, Jio or Airtel would be able to buy a particular frequency, and it is in this frequency you would have people communicating with each other. So what is happening right now? We have the telecom regulatory which has said that they would be able to auction a particular frequency for which the private players will have to pay the money to the government. However, the private players are not happy with it. Why are they not happy with it? That is because they expected a pay cut of nearly 90%. So they feel that whatever prices that the telecom regulatory authority has now placed is even on the higher pedestal. So they were expecting a cut of about 95%, but what they are witnessing right now is cut of about 35 to 40%, which is not enough, say these private players. Added to it, the private players also say they did compare the global auction plan as well. They did look into multiple countries, and most of the countries companies have been charging very less, but when it comes to India, they are charging quite exorbitant, which ultimately means that these people would be making the investments, but they would not be able to generate the profits, and ultimately the telecom sector would be the major sufferer. As of now, we have the telecom sector which is already under huge losses. It is only Jio which is able to make some profits, but we have Airtel, we have Vodafone which is already under tremendous losses. If they have to pay the money to the government of India right now in the form of the spectrum auction, they would not be able to sustain their businesses, they would not be able to maintain the profits, and ultimately some of the companies may also have to bundle as well. One such example that we can speak of is Vodafone and Idea, which is already under tremendous of losses. If these continue to pay more to the government, they would not be able to operate, and ultimately what we will have is a duopoly in the form of Jio and Airtel, and it is the customers who are bound to suffer in the near future. Added to it, these people also go on to say that when it comes to the previous auction, we did have the auction released by the telecom regulatory. In that particular auction as well, many spectrum was lying idle as well. They were not able to buy the spectrum. Why? Because the prices that these telecom operators had kept was again exorbitant. It was on a higher pedestal. They were not able to buy this particular spectrum, and the spectrum went for a wastage. Since these players were not able to buy the spectrum was idle, and there was a wastage of the spectrum, say these private players. So what is that they are requesting? They are requesting that this initial cost or the spectral auction should be comparatively reduced by about 80 to 90%, so that they are able to spend it for the spectrum auction, so that they are able to make profits in the near future, and ultimately they would be able to sustain their businesses in a peaceful manner. What if this auction price is not cut down? In this particular case, what would happen? You would have two options. One, because you have the private players like Jio, Airtel, Vodafone, what would they do? They would have made huge amount of investment. Since they have made the investment, how can they make the profits? One is by raising the tariffs, the other is by increasing the number of people in that particular organization, that is increasing the customer base. If they increase the tariff because they have to make the profits, who would be the major sufferers? It would be the customers. Let's say for example, if you have to pay 500 rupees for now, hypothetical example, in the near future they may charge you 800 rupees, in the near future they may charge you 1000 rupees for 3 months calling as well as data. But now, because the government is not cutting down or may not cut down, the regulator operator may not cut down, they may increase the tariffs, which ultimately will fall on the customer. The other issue that we may also face is the customer base will remain the same. The competition is cutthroat. So what would happen? There would be further increases in the number of applications released by these companies. There would be more competition to get the customers, and in fact, the customers may see more applications coming forward from these operators as well. So what is that we understand here? We should understand that the telecom regulator has cut down the base price for the spectrum auction, which is about 35 to 40%, but this is not enough. This has to be reduced to about 90% so that they are able to continue with their operations by the spectrum, which will be helpful both for the government as well as for the operators and ultimately for the customers, is what is this article all about. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says, what's fueling inflation in rural India? What is this article speaking about? The article here is drawing a comparison between the urban areas as well as the rural areas. Generally, it is perceived that inflation in the urban areas would be comparatively more in comparison to the rural areas. However, the article currently goes on to say that if you juxtapose, if you compare these two, the urban area and the rural areas, the inflation is quite more in the rural areas. So the article here examines what are the possible reasons as to why inflation is more when it comes to the rural sector. When we look into the statistics, the retail inflation rate has increased to 6.95% in the year March 2022. The inflation has reached its highest level in 1.5 years. The increase in the fuel price and the impact of the global oil prices will also be reflected in April. What do we understand by this? When you consider the fuel prices are increasing. The fuel prices either should have been brought down by the government of India, but instead of it, what is the government doing? The government at the central level, the government at the state level are passing it on to the customers. So what is happening? There is increase of the prices of the fuel. Why? One is because of the external factor, that is in the form of Ukraine-Russia crisis. The other is because the governments are not ready to shell out the taxation as well. So as a result, because of the increase of the fuel prices, it is the customer who is facing the brunt of it. When fuel prices increase, what would happen? Every other sector would get impacted. Why? Because let's say, for example, if you have to move tomatoes or any of the agricultural commodities or any other commodities, what you require is the logistics. So when there is movement of this particular agricultural good or tomatoes or onions or any of the fruits, what should happen? It is passed from the source to the destination via the trucks. They make use of the fuel, and ultimately it means that when an agricultural commodity or any commodity has to pass from the source to the destination, the price of it will also picture in the logistics, and as a result inflation will take a hit and ultimately inflation would be increased. Experts estimate that inflation will cross 7% mark and will sustain at that rate till the end of September. And when you consider the inflation, it is already beyond 7% in multiple states. In West Bengal, it is about 8.85%, Uttar Pradesh, Assam 8.19%, Madhya Pradesh, it is about 7.89%. So basically, the author goes on to say that in the present situation, the inflation is more than 7% in multiple states and regions in India. Now, if we have to compare inflation in the urban areas and rural areas, why is that the inflation is more in the rural areas? Inflation in urban areas has generally been higher than in the rural areas by an average of about 0.8% throughout the 2021. The exceptions are August, when both were at 5.3%, and in May 2021 when rural inflation was 6.6% and urban inflation was about 5.9%. In contrast, the inflation in rural areas has outdone the urban inflation in the first 3 months of 2022. In 2021, as we initially discussed, urban inflation was comparatively on a higher end. The exception was in terms of August as well as May, but in the year 2022, for the past 3 months, we are now in April, you consider January, February and March, the rural inflation is comparatively on the higher front in comparison to the urban inflation. From a 0.2% higher inflation rate over urban India in January, the rural inflation reached 6.38% in February, as urban inflation declined to about 5.75%. In March, urban inflation stood at 6.12% and inflation in the rural areas reached at about 7.66%. So what do we understand? We understand the fact that rural inflation is comparatively on a higher front than comparison to the urban areas. Why is this recurring? That is because, one, as we discussed, the fuel prices are increasing. When it comes to the fuel prices in the urban areas, the logistics is easy to transfer, but when it comes to the areas, they do not have much of the infrastructure, they do not have the endpoint connectivity, and as a result, when you consider fuel transfer from the source to the destination, the cost may also increase, with special emphasis to rural areas. In urban areas, you have the logistics that works out, you have the required infrastructure, but when it comes to the rural areas, in comparison to the urban areas, the infrastructure is comparatively less, the logistic prices may also increase, and as a result inflation is more when it comes to the rural areas. Food inflation is also the main factor for increasing the headline inflation rate in March, the increase in food inflation was more in rural India compared to that of the urban area. And if we consider oils and fats, it is more in the rural areas. Clothing is more in the rural areas. Footwear, it is more in the rural areas. Fuel and light is more in the rural areas. And ultimately, personal care products inflation is also more in the rural areas. In fact, the steady increase in the inflation of the education cost of about 1.5% has also had an impact on the rural inflation as well. So what do we understand? That if you consider the rural areas and the urban areas in terms of the inflation is more in the rural areas, and this is bound to hit the poor sections of the society. So it is the poor sections who will be impacted. The 20% of the below poverty line people are the ones who will be most impacted, and ultimately the poor will be the major sufferers. High inflation rates affect the poor the most, especially the rise in the food inflation rate is a key cause of concern. It is predicted that food inflation will continue to increase along with both fuel and core inflation due to the crisis in the Ukraine conflict and increase in the cost of farm inputs. This will further increase financial stress on the already burdened economy. So because of the Ukraine crisis, because we are not able to import, let's say for example sunflower oil or many of the other products from Ukraine as well as Russia, this can result in inflation, and ultimately it is the poor and the rural who are bound to suffer because of inflation is what is this article all about. Now let's look into the next article. This article says Punjab announces 300 units of free electricity. We have the Punjab government which has recently made an announcement that 300 units of free electricity per month will be provided to every household in the state of Punjab. How does this work? If we consider the scheduled caste, backward classes, below poverty line, freedom fighters who were getting 200 units already free in Punjab, this will now be increased to about 300 units. How will this be calculated? They would be able to use as much as 300 units every month. And if you consider for the 2 months, this will be about 600 units. Now, if they cross the 600 units consumption of electricity for the scheduled caste, for the backward classes, for the below poverty line, if they have consumed, let's assume for a moment, 650 units. So they have to pay for the 50 units extra. So they need not have to pay for the entire 600 units, but whatever they have consumed extra, that is, if 600 is the benchmark that is set, 50 would be the extra. So this 50 units money will have to be paid for the electricity. However, for the other households, if the electricity consumption exceeds 600 units, they may have to pay for the entire 600 units. For the scheduled caste, backward classes and the below poverty line freedom fighters, they only have to pay the extra 50 units. But in case of any other people in the state of Punjab, if they consume more than 600 for 2 months, in that particular case, they have to spend for the entire consumption. Added to it, the Chief Minister also confirmed that free electricity to farmers for the agriculture would also continue, and there would be no rise in the power tariff for commercial and industrial consumers. So what was the objective as to why the government came up with this initiative? We know for the fact that we have something called as the manifesto for a political party. Before the elections, you have the political party which gives out a manifesto. The manifesto gives out an idea to the people who want to elect a political candidate as well as a political party. According to AAP, which is the Aam Aadmi Party, which has now formed the government in Punjab, they had a particular pointer in their manifesto which said that they would want to give free electricity up to a particular point for the people of Punjab. Since they have won the elections, since they are now in power, they have formed the government. According to Aam Aadmi Party, they are keeping up to their promise as defined under the manifesto. So they go on to say that free electricity will be provided to every household, and now they would be able to save the money, and this money that they have seen can be spent on children's education and meeting other basic needs of the family in Punjab, which is why the Aam Aadmi Party in Punjab has come up with this particular proposal. What would would be the financial impact because of this free electricity that would be provided up to 300 units for a month, 600 units for a period of 2 months. Punjab already has a total financial burden of around 14,000 crore per annum on account of subsidized power to various categories, out of which the subsidy bill on account of free electricity to the farming sector alone is around 7,000 crores. And now with this particular move, it will further put an estimated additional burden of 5,000 crore on the state exchequer. Now the question is, how will it impact the people? How will it impact the state? When it comes to the state was already spending a lot of money in the form of subsidies. This is further increased by about 5,000 crores. Where will the Punjab government get this particular money is the first major criticism. The second major criticism is that when it comes to the scheduled caste, when it comes to the below poverty line, when it comes to the families and freedom fighters, they have to only pay for the extra units. But when it comes to the other people, it is for the entire units that they spend if it is beyond the 600 units. Where is the equality is the second major criticism. Added to it, there are people who also criticize that if there is a family currently which is making use of 150 units of electricity, since 300 units is free, they may start consuming more and ultimately they may go up to 300 units as well. So as a result, the electricity consumption in the state may also increase. Added to it, there would be joint families in the state. These joint families currently may have a single meter, but in the near future they may start splitting the meter and ultimately there will be more consumption of the electricity. More the consumption of the electricity, it is the government which has to spend the money, but where is the government getting this particular money is the third major criticism. However, there are many others who also say that since 300 units is what is kept as a benchmark, many people will now start reducing their consumption to fall within the bracket, and this may further decrease the electricity consumption. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says Childline 1098 may be merged with Emergency Helpline 112. This article here is speaking about the Childline. What do we understand by Childline? Let's say for example, there is a child who is in a lot of trauma. The child is going through some lot of emotional stress. The child has seen sexual abuse, or the child is living on the streets. There is a child laborer who is working in an unorganized sector being abused by the master, or there might be a child who is a domestic help requiring some assistance, or there is a child who is affected physically, emotionally, sexually, either in the family or in the schools or in the institutions. In all these cases, any child who is less than 18 years of age would be able to call up one of the numbers called as 1098. So the minute this particular child calls up 1098, there would be assistance provided by the Ministry of Women and Child Development. There would be assistance provided by Childline Indian Foundation, where it is this particular program which is run by a private trust called as Childline Foundation, which receives money from the Ministry of Women and Child Development under the Integrated Child Protection Scheme, which is now part of Mission Vatsalya. So basically, this is an integrated program where you have the private sector, where you have the government sector. Basically, they come together to take care of the children who are in emotional distress. How does this Childline work in reality? If there is a child who is in need of help, it will immediately call up Childline 1098. The minute this call is placed, emotional support and guidance will be provided by this child helpline. Information and referral services would be provided to the children, and all information required for that particular child will be provided with the help of Childline 1098. If we have to consider the statistics, 50 lakh calls have been answered by the Childline. 3.95 lakh children were provided emergency assistance in 2020 and 21, and number of children were also provided rehabilitation services as well. Now, what is the context? The government has come up with the draft guidelines for Mission Vatsalya, where this child protection service Childline will be integrated with the universal helpline 112 of the Ministry of Home Affairs that provides assistance with services related to police, health and women's safety. This is where we have number of civil society organizations who are opposing this particular move. Why are they opposing this move? As of now, the funding is provided by the Ministry of Women and Child Development. This particular mission will now be integrated with that of the Ministry of Home Affairs. This is where the civil society organizations have a problem. Children's work not only involves rescuing children but also counseling them. Initially, these children will be little reluctant. They may not open up to them. They'll remain silent for number of days, and over a period of time, you would have the social activists who would be able to empathize with the cause of the children. They would be able to understand what a child is going through, and ultimately they would be able to provide assistance to this particular child. So this takes a lot of time to building that comfort zone for the child. But if this is merged with the Ministry of Home Affairs, who would answer the calls? It is the police. Police may not be sensitive to this particular cause. We are not saying that they may not understand, but they are not trained for this. So the police are trained only to interrogate. They may not know how to be sensitive to the children. In that particular case, the children may not open up to these people, and ultimately number of calls may drop, and these children may face the issue of stress, and ultimately this entire objective will fail, says this article. So basically, this whole process of integrating the child helpline with that of the Ministry of Home Affairs number 112 will not serve the purpose, is what is this article all about. Now let's look into the next article. This article says social media apps must take steps to protect the women. What is this article speaking about? Recently we have had issues with respect to women on the social media platforms. We have number of mobile applications. One is in reference to the bully by case, where the bully by case is related to online auction of women of a particular community, where photos of these prominent women from the community were uploaded on the bully by app without their permission, where they were auctioned virtually. Another case is in reference to Clubhouse case, where a verbal chat room had hundreds of young boys and girls using vulgar language and talking about sexually assaulting the women. What does this signify? These two instances signify that women are being objectified. Without the permission of the women, their photos were taken, they were put in an application, and they were put on a virtual auction mode, violating the very modesty of the women. Added to it, there have been vulgar messages with respect to the women, and ultimately respect for women was violated in both these cases. So this article currently goes on to say, as a means to ensure that this should not happen, what should be the steps that needs to be taken? In both these applications, what were common? Both these applications had young people who had built this application and were involved in this particular cases. In both the cases, that these people who had developed it wanted to be anonymous as well, and at the same time they also had an ideology that women should not come out of their homes. They need to be objectified, they need to be suppressed, their independence should not be given. These were some of the common things amongst these two applications. In order to overcome this, the article currently goes on to say that this has to be viewed from multiple viewpoints. What are those? One, we have to take into picture the accused. Who is an accused? Let's say, for example, the person who's created this particular application. So this person who's created the application should be counseled as well. So this person should be sent to the rehabilitation, and after he is back from the counseling and rehabilitation centers, it is not just about following what is being taught in the counseling center, but this also has to be monitored as well. Once he is out of the rehabilitation, whether he is following it will have to be checked and monitored on a periodic basis. On one side, we take the accused into picture. On the other side, victim counseling will also have to be taken up. Why? Because there are instances where these women who have not given the permission, their photos are misused, there is vulgar language being used against them, so they also go through emotional trauma and distress. So victims of social media abuse, like those who are subjected to be extortion, should also receive counseling, is the second recommendation. The third recommendation is in reference to the applications and the developers. Whenever there is a social media application that is being developed, there should be an algorithm. The algorithm should be in such a way that if there is hatred that is brewing, if there are certain vulgar words that is being used against women, such should be immediately be blocked. So the algorithm of this application should be designed in such a way that vulgar words should not be directed against the women, and if it is used, such person should be blocked immediately. So that is to do with the algorithm side. On the other side, there should also be a specific grievance cell as well, that if a person feels that there is a vulgar action being committed by another person, this has to be reported to that social media platform, and the social media platform will immediately have to ensure that such person is blocked or his account is deleted. Finally, an awareness will have to be created amongst the parents, teachers and psychologists. All have to collaborate. They have to bring in an awareness with respect to how social media has to be used with respect to both the men as well as the women. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the mains practice question. Rising inflation hurts the poor in the rural areas. In the light of the statement, examine the factors fueling higher inflation. How does the free electricity scheme in Punjab work? Discuss its impact on the consumers and the government. So please write all your answers on the comment section. Peer review. Do give positive feedback to your friends' answers. So this is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.